That's good. Welcome to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, to our second monthly Let's Talk Art. In a few moments, you'll be listening to a conversation between Heather South of the Maryland Art Conservation, Sarah Hall, director at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, and Daniel Fulco of the Washington County Museum of Fine Art, who is our curator there. We'll be enjoying a wonderful program, and you'll notice that only presenters will be able to speak, but our viewers can feel free to ask questions or comments below. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll notice that there is a Q&A and chat option. You may notice that there are a couple of notifications coming through in red. That could include helpful links and resources that support the presentation, and it could also be other viewers asking questions. So if you do ask a question, either I or Jillian McMaster, the Education and Marketing Associate, will be there to view the question and find an appropriate time to interject your question. And at the end of the presentation, you'll find that I will try to stop the presenters as politely as I can around the 40-minute mark so that we can have time for more question and answers and for any that we may have missed. You'll also notice that if you don't like the view that you have on your screen, up on the upper right-hand side of your Zoom screen, you can toggle around the viewing options. So I hope you enjoy this program and you can sit back and listen and relax. And I'm now going to hand it over to Sarah Hall, director at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this appropriately breathtaking fall day. And welcome to the online museum for this very special edition of Let's Talk Art. Tonight, we're going to talk about the power and beauty in nature and in art. And I have a few things to say before we kick off the program. Jillian just disappeared, just FYI, but she's still there to help. I always think it's funny when faces come and go like that. But it's nice to have a team behind the scenes. So before we kick it off, I just want to say that, as always, we appreciate your support. It's a difficult year. We're all learning new skills, new ways of conducting our lives. The museum is open right now with two wonderful exhibitions, Seldom Seen, which is a fascinating show that Daniel curated with objects normally in storage. And that closes November 1st, so get into the museum and see it if you haven't. And we also have The World of Jan Brett, which is just a delightful family-friendly exhibition that will be up through January 10th. So come on and visit us. But while we're open and we're hosting exhibitions, we can't do these kinds of programs in person yet because we just can't gather people in these kinds of groups. So this is just a reminder to all of you that if you have the ability to help the museum, there are a lot of things we can't do. Our gift shop sales are down. We can't host programs where we might sell tickets. We can't do the kind of facility rental business that we normally would be doing. So whatever you can do to help us, we appreciate. If that's renewing your membership, thank you. If you can donate to our annual fund, thank you. Excitingly and more fun maybe is shopping at our annual treasure sale, which is an online format this year. And the link will go live on November 1st for previewing the items. Bidding starts on November 5th. There's a lot of really fun and fascinating things, a good place to do holiday shopping. So check on our website for the link to the treasure sale and try to have some fun with that. So tonight, we have a special guest with us, Heather Smith, who is the owner and chief conservator of Maryland Art Conservation. Before she was the owner, she worked there and she had her Master's of Art Conservation at Queen's University, Ontario, Canada. So she's been here in Maryland now for, I think, 16 years. Does that sound right, Heather? Yeah. And we're really happy to have her in relatively close proximity to help us care for the collection. We're gonna start talking about art in just a moment, and I'm gonna tell you an anecdote, which when I found out that the Cropsy painting was coming back from conservation, and I have to also put a thank you in here to Elsie Morey, whose generosity helped us to fund the conservation of the Cropsy painting and also the Moran etching that you're going to see later on in the program. Here's the screen share popping up for a moment here, but I have to change my view for a moment. The tricks of online programming. So anyway, where were we? I was saying thank you to Elsie, whose generosity enabled us to conserve the Cropsy painting and the Thomas Moran print that you will see a little bit later. And the reason I was so excited when the Cropsy painting came back is that I had heard this story about Jasper Cropsey living in England for, I think, about 7 years, and the folks in England not believing, here's the monumental painting that he displayed in London, Autumn on the Hudson River from 1860, and that there was apparently some concern that his depiction of American foliage was untrue, that there just couldn't be those kind of vivid colors. And indeed, you know, there's a story that he had leaves sent to London in order for people to be able to see that it was true. And there is this great quote where he writes home asking for autumn leaves, and his friend F.A. Otis replies, "Some 2 months ago, I gave to Mr. Falconer for you a large collection of very fine forest leaves, which my beloved wife and I gathered and pressed last fall. I was much chagrined the other day, calling on Mr. Falconer, to find he had not yet found an opportunity to forward them to you. When they do come to you, you will, I trust, find them as fine as when we packed them. If so, I am confident you will be able to convince your English friends that your rendering of the American autumn forest is true." And I also love that when the leaves arrived, it becomes a kind of installation project, because Cropsey gets the leaves and he scatters them around the base of the painting, which I believe is about 5 feet tall and 9 feet wide. So it became a really immersive experience. And that is why he's known as the master of autumn, getting that painting back from the Conservator studio in October, right when you know, the museum is located in City Park. There's so much color and beauty all around us. It just seemed absolutely the right time to spend a little bit of time with Jasper Cropsey and the Hudson River School. So you can go ahead and forward on, Daniel.
And here we have a couple, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because we're billing this as sort of, you know, a talk show with some presentations in it, I think that taking a few pauses for conversation along the way makes sense. And so there's a question here: what did nature mean to artists of the Hudson River School? And what did it mean? Did it mean something different to artists of the larger Romantic movement? So I'm going to let Daniel, our curator, answer that. And Heather, if you have anything you want to add, that's fine too, and I can jump in as well.
For the Hudson River School artists, the American landscape really became this both a notion and also an aesthetic about exploring who we are as American people at a time when the nation is still relatively new. Thinking back that we only were really formed at the end of the 18th century, these artists started to look, of course, to European landscape conventions for inspiration, but they were specifically, like here we're showing you a detail of our Frederick Church painting. They were looking to the wilderness of America for inspiration. And specifically what they wanted to do was they wanted to present idealized nature to the public, to people who loved art, and for it to become an immersive experience, that these forests, as well as rivers and creeks, natural formations, geological and otherwise, and also looking at different kinds of weather, all of these natural phenomena were part of this promise of the new country and what it had in store. And it meant that that landscape didn't necessarily always have to tell a story anymore. In other words, it could be just simply about the natural environment. And it's, and then we have some leaves.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, we talked about this a little bit before, but I think for a lot of people who are not art historians, but know something about art and are familiar with the Hudson River School, and in fact, I think these paintings still engender a sense of patriotism because they're this sort of original manifestation of pride in our resources and the richness of America. But I think a lot of people think of it as being so American. They don't realize that these artists are really part of the larger Romantic movement and that they're really sophisticated, well-traveled part of the international world. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or maybe that's a good time to talk about Cropsey's biography.
Yes, I would add to that, for example, looking here at Frederick Church, by the time he gets well into his midway through his career, and then by the time he gets to the end of his career, he's a very wealthy man, and he builds for himself a beautiful mansion that overlooks the Hudson. Some of you may have visited it, called Olana, which is getting up in upstate New York. So people like Cropsey and Church did quite well for themselves, and Asher B. Durant as well. So we'll be seeing an image of his work later in the program, but they were really quite the stars of their day. And in some cases, when the paintings that they exhibited were unveiled, it was a to-do and very theatrical, complete with a curtain and an elaborate wooden frame that was constructed if the painting were very large.
So we did actually have a question come in, and since I think it's nice to deal with them in context, the question is, what influence did the artist Constable have on the Hudson River School?
He had certainly some influence on particular painters. We'll be getting to him later on in the presentation. But one that comes to mind is Thomas Moran. Being from England himself, he sought inspiration from people like Constable Turner. So that's one that comes to mind right off the bat.
But I think that this whole, so the Romantic movement, we didn't really talk about the Romantic movement and the idea that it's about feeling and expression and subjectivity. If you think of Romantic movement in music, and the power of nature is huge. And I think that maybe that's a difference in approach between Europeans and Americans too. The sense of the sublime, which, you know, the smallness of man, which we certainly see in Hudson River School paintings, but I think it shifts a little from fear and terror maybe in American paintings. What do you think, Daniel?
Yes, I think that what's unique about American landscape, particularly once the Hudson River School are to settle into a groove, if you will, is that they focus specifically on the natural environment. Like here, that the subject itself is the sunset on the Hudson River, this creek in the Hudson River Valley, and that it's not always about a historical subject set within the landscape or something that's biblical.
We do have a tiny little person in a boat there on the left, so we do see how nature dwarfs man there.
Exactly. But it's still about, as Sarah was saying, it's still about the sublime that goes back to the European tradition, but it's now cast within the American landscape, American wilderness.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll let you move on. We'll take some other sort of conversation breaks along the way.
Here are some images that we've included. These are carte de visites. They're early style of photograph, and they show Jasper Cropsey and his wife Maria when they had a chance to meet the Queen Victoria in 1861. And the Queen was also involved with seeing the Autumn on the Hudson River, the painting that we were discussing at the beginning of the presentation. Here are also a few more photos of the artist who had, when he was younger, he had very bright red hair. He was very distinctive looking. I'll just move those so you can see.
Maybe that's why he liked the leaves so much.
It might have been. Red had a significance to him. And here is one of his early works. So when he started out, here he's only just shy of 30 years old. He did do works that had historical connotations, or we would say allegorical. This shows medieval knights who are making their way across a bridge here from a castle. But what's really fantastic about this painting that's down in the National Gallery is it's as if a medieval castle set atop this precipice meets the Alps or perhaps the American Rockies. So the painting is sort of a conglomeration of different natural views that Cropsey would have had access to. And he had recently done a trip to Europe, and he would have absorbed some of these conventions while he was over there. And that over there is a self-portrait of him a little bit later in life. Very well done. But as time goes on, he starts moving in a different direction. And specifically, his passion is to depict areas in New Jersey. And this is Lake Wawayanda, Sussex County. And the colors, I want you to keep this in mind as we go forward. This painting at the New Britain Museum of American Art are very similar to the one in the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. Again, that wonderful red coloring of the leaves, but also contrasted with gold light. And then you can see here also the reflection of the light off the clouds in the sky. This was a place that was very important to Cropsey. It's located near Orange, New Jersey today, sort of going west of what would be southwest of Newark, New Jersey. But at that time, it was still the countryside, around 1870. Here are also a couple of engravings that that show Mr. Cropsey's house from the north side. And it should be mentioned that Jasper Cropsey was also an architect. He designed his own home and studio, for example. He also received commissions to design the Moravian Church on Staten Island, which is where he was born. And today that church is still standing, as well as the Rowayton train station in Connecticut, which is not far from Westport on the southwest part of the state. So he was a multi-talented individual. But later on in his life, he would relocate to this place called Everest, which was his home and studio at Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. And you can go and visit it today. Still, I believe that it's managed by the Newington Cropsey Foundation, which is very close to Hastings-on-Hudson as well. But Cropsey, go ahead.
He outlived his popularity is the sad end of the story, I guess, in the sense that he's downsizing and scaling back. Yeah.
Yes, Cropsey enjoyed a very prolific career through about the 1880s. But as the century wore on, Impressionism arose as a style, and it began to replace or supplant the Romantic Hudson River School style. So Cropsey had a bit of a struggle with trying to provide for himself later in his years. He was also, as I recall, Sarah, he was beset by a number of tragedies, including the loss of a child. Is that correct?
His daughter, I think two of his daughters died. One of them died with her husband in a train accident. He ended up raising his two little granddaughters when he and his wife were in their 70s, I believe.
Yes. So he had some difficulties later on in life, but one of the ways that he supplemented his income was, as I mentioned, those architectural commissions for one way, that he did this later on in life. And I think that it probably dealt a blow to him because his style quickly became eclipsed by modernist movements, Impressionism being one of them.
He's also one of those artists, you often read these stories about, he was a sickly child, and so there was a lot of time to develop creativity, but he was winning prizes by the time he was 14. So it must be hard when you discover your talent and you blossom so quickly and so well to then have sort of outlived that moment.
Yes, absolutely. And when he was young in 1844, he became the youngest artist to ever be elected an associate member of the National Academy of Design in New York, which was the most prestigious school of the visual arts in the country at the time, and an institution to which all the Hudson River School painters eventually belonged. So it would have been hard on him. And in this slide, we're looking at the autumn landscape of the river that belongs to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. And it's really a stunning painting. And the exact view that it depicts is hard to say, because oftentimes Hudson River School artists created imaginary views. this could be a particular vantage point along the Hudson River, but it's not entirely clear. But what's interesting about the painting is that it's very similar to another one over in Spain in the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection, and it's called Greenwood Lake. And you can see the similarities, but the scene of Greenwood Lake is quite different. This Greenwood Lake is in New Jersey, heading towards the Appalachians in the northwest part of the state, as I recall, west-northwest. So you can see how he used the rays that are emanating from the sun over here. Similar type of clouds as well to the painting that we have here in Hagerstown. This is part of his signature style of the 1870s. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the painting got to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. Well, its first exhibition in our museum was in a show called A Selection of American Paintings from Hesselius to Edward Lampton Emery. And this is the brochure that was produced for the exhibition, January 1 to 30 in 1952. And this was very kindly loaned by the Macbeth Gallery in New York. And I brought here a couple of pieces of correspondence that were then directed to director Bruce Etchison. And here you can see that he was corresponding with Bruce, but that the Cropsey painting was part of these works that included colonial portraits that were exhibited in 52. And then there's a very interesting series of letters that go back and forth between Robert McIntyre, who owned the gallery, and Bruce Etchison, our former director. And here, Robert McIntyre lists what is available. And here you can see the Jasper Cropsey landscape autumn, and he's offering him a couple of different ones here for his consideration. At the time, Macbeth had quite a few of these in his inventory. And this is sort of where this all started, was the back and forth between these two people in the art world back in the 1850s. And through several other letters, eventually the two of them came to an arrangement whereby the museum purchased it from the gallery. Here you can see it featured in the summer 1962 museum bulletin. And here's the painting itself. And it was part of the Feature Your Museum collection. Really very neat how they used to do this back then. And it gave a little description, and it was purchased in 1955. So it was shown in 1952, and then 3 years later, we made the purchase. So from there, I'm going to turn it over to Heather, and she's going to tell you a little bit about how this painting was recently conserved with the generous support of Elsie Moore. So take it away, Heather.
He's here with us, I'm happy to say.
Hello, everyone. We can probably go to my first slide. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the painting itself as an object, and then I'll get into the treatment. So I performed this treatment back in March of this year. The painting itself is about 18 inches by 36 inches. So it's rather small and portable, and it is a typical size of Cropsey's other paintings. The oil paints are applied fluidly in a very traditional style. It's painted on a pre-primed canvas, which was stretched over a stretcher. And then a natural resin varnish coats the surface. This would have been applied by the artist after the paints had had a chance to dry. And then it just serves as a protective layer and helps to even out surface irregularities and saturate the colors. So that's sort of the front. If we go to the next slide. Oh, maybe the next one. There we go. So this is the painting's reverse. As you can see, it is a substantial 5-member stretcher with wooden tensioning keys at the corners. And those keys serve to tension the canvas. So if you tap them in, they expand the corners and then pull the canvas taut on the front. And this is a typical stretcher for the era. The construction is very typical. Let's see, it has some other markings on the reverse that are sort of illegible, aside from the Goupil's label, and they might be notations from a framer or some other person who's come across the painting over the years. But I will talk about the Goupil's label because that can tell us a little bit about the painting as well. And then, yeah, let's go to the next one. So this is a more intact version of that label. We know it was used in the 1870s by Michael Knoedler and Company, who was a successor to Goupil's. I kept the name because it was well known. They were located at 5th Avenue and 22nd Street. Let's see, it was a well-known New York gallery that existed actually until relatively recently. It was in business from 1846 to 2011. So that's 165 years, making it one of the oldest commercial art galleries in the United States. We can go to the next slide. Just for a little bit of fun, we can take a trip to Goupil's during the 1870s. And here it is at the location. And it was clearly a popular place. It's been illustrated in the local media of the time. And it's basically an art dealership where they would have sold framed prints and artworks, and then they offered framing services as well. So I imagine that Cropsey, or whoever he sold his painting to, would have taken it here to get it framed, and then that's when they would have attached the label to the reverse. So it was probably framed, you know, close to when it was painted, since it's all happening sort of in the 1870s. Just another, we can go to the next slide, just another fun picture. This is the inside. And I just feel like it sort of illustrates to a certain extent of how little has changed over the years in galleries, because today you can walk into a gallery and buy your framed artwork, or there's a line of the frame corners where you can pick out your frame and have them order it to your specific size. So much like you can do today. So obviously,
it does seem like a boom, right? So a lot of these European galleries were opening American outposts because of this sort of boom in collecting, and that's quite a packed gallery. I'm impressed by it.
We actually have a question. What's the difference between conservation and restoration?
Well, so we, as professional conservators, like to use the word conservation. Not that we don't perform some restoration aspects, but conservation has more of a preservation sound to it. We aim to preserve what's original without really altering anything that's original. So any alterations I make to a painting, it's only on damages, or I'm not looking to make any changes to the artist's original intention. So restorations has sort of a more hands-on sound to it, whereas conservation is more about preservation of our cultural heritage. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think we can go to the next slide. So sort of in the same vein of what would have been available to Cropsey at the time, he actually would have had access to a lot of commercially available art supplies. There was a lot of innovation happening in the 19th century, especially from the first half to the latter half when Cropsey would have been working. And especially in New York City, more and more of these shops were popping up. So he could really, you know, get most of the things we can get today. But one of the biggest innovations was the invention of the paint tube, which happened in 1840. So perhaps earlier in Cropsey's career, he may not have been using a paint tube. It's hard to know exactly when they were extremely widespread. But at any rate, prior to the paint tube, artists were storing their paint in pigskin bladders. So paint would have been prepared by grinding the natural pigment down into a powder. And then, like in this image you can see here, you would add in your natural resin or your drying oils, depending on your recipe you're using. And then you're using ground glass and a muller, which is that glass object that's used to grind the pigment. And then you would transfer it into your pigskin bladder, which gets tied tightly at the top and plugged with some sort of pin. But as you can imagine, this was not ideal. Pigskin bladders were known to either dry out prematurely or burst. So it really wasn't great to take out on the road with you. But once you could use a tube oil paint, you can more easily go outside. So we can look at the paint boxes. So Renoir's paint box we're looking at from later in the 19th century. He's obviously using paint tubes, and that was a huge boon for the Impressionists, because then they could go outside and paint en plein air, and as well as with the Hudson River School. But if we go up to Thomas Cole's paint box, although I do believe he was probably painting outside, he was muddling through with his pigskin bladders in the 1830s and 40s. But otherwise, a lot of the other supplies would have been available to the artists, especially starting around mid-century. They were sort of catching up with Europe in what was available to the artists. So, okay, I think we can move on to talking about the treatment. Now that we know the elements that go into making an oil painting, we can talk about the condition issues and its conservation treatment. So this painting this is how it appeared when it first arrived at my studio earlier this year. It had undergone previous conservation treatment or restoration, however you'd like to say. But so overall, it doesn't look too, in terrible shape. But the restoration probably happened approximately probably prior to 1970, if not a couple of decades before that. So a lot of the aging restorations are, 50 plus years old, and they're starting to deteriorate and discolor. The surface was very dirty and dusty. There's an overall yellow sheen, yellow hue to the painting, which will be the discolored natural resin varnish, which is covering the entire surface. And I should note that that's not the original varnish we're looking at. During previous restoration, they had removed the varnish and replaced it with a replacement varnish, which again has still had 50 plus years to yellow again. So it's about time to have it removed. The painting had been lined, which means it had been glued to an auxiliary backing fabric. And that would have been done to repair. There's several tears present. And it was probably just an aging canvas that needed a little extra support. So what they do is they glue it to another fabric. And in this case, they used a starch-based adhesive, which is very typical for sort of the mid-century when you're doing restorations. Let's see, is there a next slide with a detail? Yes. There are several tears which aren't exactly obvious in this image, but when looking at it in sort of raking light, it was very obvious because the retouchings were sort of clunky and sitting up high, and they were covering original healthy paint, and they were starting to discolor. There are sort of insect stains and other just unpleasant stains on the surface, and scrapes and scratches along the edges. It was probably loose in its frame at one point. So there's other scrapes. So these are the types of damages that were present. So fortunately, the painting was in good structural condition. So my treatment focused mainly on aesthetic issues and removing and replacing the old restoration materials and just sort of refreshing it. So we go to the next slide. So my treatment started with surface soil removal. Here is my dirty swab after just a couple of rolls, so it was quite soiled. I do roll my own swabs because I can control the size of the swab and sort of the density depending on what I'm doing. And actually I did remove the the soil with saliva in this case. And I know that sounds rather unsettling, especially during a pandemic, but our saliva does make a good cleaning agent. It has natural enzymes and is a neutral pH. So
Say, what is it that conservators always write it up as on their reports? Is it gentle enzymatic cleaning or something?
Yes. Yes. So try to make it sound a little better, but but it works. Obviously, it works better than water. But it didn't require, and it worked better than any other. I tested other cleaning agents, and this was what worked the best. And then in this image too, you can sort of get a sense of the artist's brushwork in this lighting. In some areas, it's sort of more generously applied. In other areas, he's putting it on as more of a thinner wash. And I can just imagine him sort of working rapidly in order to capture certain lighting condition, and just, you know, you kind of get a sense of the artist's working methods. So, okay, next slide. Here, the next step of the treatment involved removing the varnish. And again, here's my dirty swab. You can see the brown varnish that came off. It's quite discolored. And you can just sort of get a sense of the brighter, cooler colors. And again, just see a better view of the artist's brushwork. I did end up using acetone to remove the varnish. I had tested a bunch of other mild solvents, but acetone worked best to remove the varnish without, you know, impacting the artist's paint below, so it was safe to use. And let's see, and then we can go on to the next slide. Here's a during cleaning shot. So on the right half, obviously the varnish and repaint has been removed, and then on the left half it is yet to be removed. And you can see where there are some tears in the back of the horizon line. So I ended up using a slightly stronger solvent to remove the repaint on those tears. So I softened them with the solvent, and then I coaxed the repaint off using a scalpel under magnification to reveal the artist's canvas below. And again, the restorations were especially discolored when you're comparing it to the original paint, and they were clunky and just sort of covering original material. So they definitely needed to come off. Let's see, I can go to the next slide. And here it is, just before in painting, I've varnished the painting using a synthetic varnish that's specifically designed for use in conservation. It aims to mimic the sheen of a natural resin varnish, but it has much better aging properties. So it's less likely to discolor this to the same extent. And then the white areas you're seeing, that's where old damages and tears were uncovered. It is a white water-soluble putty that I used to bring the gaps up to the same level as the paint. And conservators typically use materials that are easily reversible, but they maintain their integrity over time. And in, let's say, 50 to 100 years, when someone might need to restore this or conserve it again, the conservator will be able to see what I've done, what I've added, and then they'll be able to remove it easily without, you know, damaging any original paint. So that's sort of our ethical guidelines. We try to do no harm. Okay, next slide. Just a couple more detail images of the damages. And then the bottom image is shows Cropsey's signature. It's in great condition, and there were no red flags. I'm certain it's original. There it says J.F. Cropsey, 1870 or 79. I'm not 100% sure, but it's in the ballpark of 1870. So that's before in painting. And then finally, after some careful in painting, treatment is complete. So again, I attempted to match sort of the sheen and texture of the original paint with my in painting and my fills. So in theory, they're undetectable to the naked eye. And then overall with the new varnish, the painting is just overall refreshed and hopefully more saturated and protected. And then I have one more slide where we can sort of compare the before and after. As again, the image obviously much brighter and clearer. There's more contrast between lights and darks, so more details sort of pop out at you than perhaps before. And most importantly, I feel like we've regained a sense of atmospheric perspective, which is so important in these sort of vast landscapes of Cropsies. We really feel like we're there in a certain way.
We are at about the 40-minute mark, just to give you all a heads up.
Thanks, Kelly. We'll speed our pace a little bit. We have some more sort of fun content, I think, ahead. So we had a little conversation break here. Was there a question in the chat or anything we missed, first of all? I thought I saw one pop up, but maybe I'm wrong. So this little conversation break, is there anything distinctively American about the Hudson River School approach to lands? So what do you say about that, Daniel?
I say that there is. I think that with the American landscapists, they really have this tremendous passion for the untamed wilderness, and in a way that you don't necessarily see with European landscape painting. Not to say that there are not unspoiled scenes in the European canon of images, but they tend to focus more over there on, for example, the Alps, or perhaps the wilds of the Nordic countries, and in some cases even up in the north country of England. But it's very different. With ours, it's often about the relationship between the human being and sort of the explorer, the hunter, and that person within nature itself. We also have, of course, and romanticized depictions of Native Americans within their landscape as well. It became very distinctive and special within the Hudson River School tradition. So those are some of my observations.
So I dropped out, as everyone noticed, probably. So my connection has been unstable tonight. It's the first time that's really happened to me here. But I'm not sure if I missed anything that you might have covered. I'm thinking of, you were talking about essentially the wilderness, this, I think, defining of American identity. Did you touch at all on religion or spirituality in the landscape?
Not yet.
Okay. Well,
too much further. There was actually a question to Heather. Philip wanted to know what did you use for the in painting?
So I use typically Gamblin conservation colors to do my in painting, and they're soluble in very sort of mild solvents.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So getting back to what I was talking about for a moment, I think also there's some sort of discussion. I think coal in particular is associated with environmentalism and a kind of unease potentially with the progress of civilization, where maybe some other artists were more comfortable with ideas of westward expansion and manifest destiny. I mean, I think there are a lot of American concerns that are really wrapped up in these paintings in a different way. And of course, the transcendentalist movement is happening, and this idea, we have a few little literary excerpts for later on, but this idea that one is communing with the divine when one is in nature.
Yes, absolutely. That is also part of it, is that this idea that emerges in the early mid-19th century that we can find spirituality, that even perhaps communicate with God through nature, is also in the consciousness of Hudson River School painters.
So we have another technical question for Heather here as we get back into conservation, which is framing with keys a British technique? I don't think it is it? But
yeah. Not particularly. Keyed stretchers were in use. It's probably started actually in France as early as the late 1700s, I believe. They did not come, keyed stretchers did not come to America until later, the mid 19th century. They were using strainers in the during the Federal period, especially, which is basically a wooden structure with fixed corners as a strainer. It's the same idea, but you couldn't expand the corners. And then slowly we caught up with Europe and England and France and started using stretchers probably closer to the 1840s and beyond.
So I'm going to briefly describe one other treatment that we had done on a Hudson River School work. And this one actually was conserved by the Conservation Center for Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia. And it is by Thomas Moran. Before I launch into that, I'm just going to give a quick background on the artist. He's one of our most beloved artists at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts because of the wonderful and rare painting he did, A View of New York City from Communipaw, New Jersey, of Lower Manhattan here. And it's quite unusual. It's sort of a celebration of and also a critique, a commentary on industrialization. In the year 1880, look at the pollution in this painting that he's depicting. And also the incredible, look at the water here, all of this waste. You can even see a propeller from a ship that's propped up over here. And you have these dockhands who are working on unloading boats and going about their business. But when you zoom out, these are these sugar refineries, billowing out, almost belching out the smoke into the air. So this is very unusual for Thomas Moran, making the painting we have at our museum very rare in the artist's oeuvre. He was born in Bolton, England, and he came to this country relatively young age. He originally trained as an engraver, and you're going to see how that sort of manifests itself later on with the work that we had conserved. But Moran was most renowned for his subjects of the American West, such as Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, 1872, which he does on the heels of a trip with the U.S. Geological Survey in 1871. Comes back to his studio and he creates these phenomenal canvases that you can see in the Washington, D.C. museums. Some of them are monumental size. And you can see how he really likes to use atmospheric perspective, like in the Communipaw painting that we have.
So I look at these and I see a lot of Turner, who of course Moran greatly admired. And I think we had a comment earlier about, the fact that some of these artists did have, friendships and relationships with romantic artists in England, and we're extremely familiar with their work. And in fact, I heard that Cropsey, knew Ruskin. And so Ruskin's call of truth to nature really makes sense when you look at Cropsey's work. And you definitely see when you look at Moran, a reference for Turner, I think.
Yes, absolutely. The American landscape has responded to currents in British landscape painting at the time as well. As Sarah was mentioning, John Ruskin, the important art critic and artist himself, about faithfully depicting nature. And some of you may know that there was a wonderful exhibition at the National Gallery last year that showed many watercolors, but also oil paintings in the relationship between British and American Pre-Raphaelites. And that's where Moran is coming out of this tradition in his works. Here's a great photo of him standing on the Bright Angel Trail at the Grand Canyon in his later years.
I stuck this in the middle of Daniel's slides because I wanted a reminder that while these artists are not really plein air painters, they might be doing a little bit of oil sketching, but they're mostly working in the studio. They are doing a lot of hard work to get their subjects. They're, going down rivers and they're climbing mountains, and they are, it's also the beginning of tourism for the general population. So they're kind of on the frontier of travel, creating the images that are attracting people to new hotels and getting people on the railways, and contributing to books on travel and tourism. It's a really kind of exciting time, I think.
Absolutely. In many ways it is. And Thomas Moran, like Cropsey, traveled, but even more extensively than Cropsey. Moran was on the road for much of his life. He made it down to Mexico. He was all over Europe. He went to Spain. He kept going back to the American West. He was very much drawn to the grand landscapes out there in the Rockies. And in fact, the artist eventually will die in Santa Barbara, California at the end of his life in the mid-1920s. So he had an exciting career. And here's the etching that's in our collection here on the left that we had conserved. And it is called Long Island Landscape. But I just want to show you that Moran has this tremendous technique as a printmaker. This is an etching, and it has an incredible amount of detail. He would have done this on probably a copper, potentially a steel plate. This is from 1889. You can see this lone figure making his or her way down this path. And in the background, we can see cattle, as well as perhaps a storm that's brewing in the sky up there. And look at how he's contrasted the light and dark on the foliage of the trees, likely in spring or summer, full bloom. And here's an oil painting that's called Near Southampton, just a couple years later in the Minnesota Marine Art Museum in Winona, Minnesota, which is not far from Wisconsin. But you can see how he was drawing upon the surroundings there on eastern Long Island. That's what these are from. And later in his life, he would build a house and a studio out there. And he would spend many a summer out there sketching and painting, and then going back into his studio and creating these tremendous prints like the one on the left. So this is the before of our Long Island landscape, which was a gift of Mary Bester Knisley Bowman in 1973. And before the print went to conservation, it had acid matte burn on it. It had a tremendous amount of fading, and it really needed a lot of work. These are the photos that show you just before it was going to be conserved. And essentially what the team did up there at the CCAHA in Philadelphia, this is the after, is they clean the surface using an additive-free polyurethane chemical, and using them with sponges. They avoided the media, that is the image itself. And then what they did was they washed it in a dilute sodium citrate solution. And after that, the object was rinsed overall in calcium-enriched deionized water to reduce soluble acids. And then after that, the piece was dried under weights to flatten it out. So here you can see that it hadn't been flattened, it had been cleaned, but then it's flattened out over here on the left.
This is one of those don't try this at home.
Yes. No bleach bath or something like that you might read about online.
Conservators must be driven crazy by people messing with things at home.
So the results were really quite striking for this print. And I just want to show you detail of his signature. He signed this on the etching plate, and he had a great one. It almost looks like an arrow or the point of a spade, and that's a T, and then it's a Moran. And this was one of his monograms. And then down below, he signed in pencil. But that was how they would do it back in the late 19th century. Tremendous detail that he achieved in this. You can see all of his lines, how down into this etching plate he got. And he was really a master printmaker, because when he was a young artist, that's where he got his start. And then you can see the before on the left and then the after. Quite a difference.
So why don't we go through some pictures with a little bit of a picked up pace here for folks,
Yes.
But I want them to get to see things.
That's right. We've got other works that Heather's studio has worked on in the past. And here are just some of our favorites in the collection that also relate to American landscape. We've got Thomas Burt, the American artist who was born in England too. This is his fabulous shipwreck. And you can see how similar our example is to the shipwreck at the Brooklyn Museum of Art on the left, with these rocky crags and the ship that's got caught on the reef. And then ours on the right. Tremendous drama. This is all about the romantic sublime and the struggle for survival. And since Heather was working in the studio when this was conserved in 2005, she can tell you a little bit about what they did. So we move through these.
Gladly. So again, this painting had been restored previously. It had been lined, and I believe it had a couple of little tears and things that would have been the impetus for the lining. And then it was stretched over a new stretcher at the time, but it was still obviously very dirty and had a discolored varnish again. So very similar treatment to the Cropsy painting. Here, what we're looking at, so sort of the center panel where your mouse is, I believe just the dirt has been removed there. And then on the far right, that's the dirt and varnish has been removed. So every layer sort of added another level of darkness to this poor painting. But as you can see, once it's cleaned up and then the repairs, re-painted, we can really focus on what we're meant to focus on, which is the amazing image.
Yes, the results were really quite something from this conservation. And last year, in preparation for the refurbishment of our American art galleries, Heather also had the opportunity to work on our Alexander Francois Loman's landscape with Native Americans. And this image shows it before it received treatment. And then we have the before and during.
Right, another dramatic cleaning. Again, very similar. It had been, this time it had been not lined, but mariflage to a flat board. So it was glued to a board, obviously extremely yellow. It had this awful tear in the tree line on the right that you can see with the naked eye. So I sort of, again, removed the dirty varnish and the darkened restorations and just refreshed them. And now you've really regained that sense of atmospheric perspective that's so important.
Absolutely. And then you can see it when it's completed and then put back in the frame. Quite a difference. And now we come to a classic image, a quintessential image of the Hudson River School. Right. Kindred Spirits by Asher Brown Durant.
So I felt like if we were going to add a little bit of sort of literary context to this as a wrap up, I couldn't not refer to Kindred Spirits, which portrays, it's a tribute to Thomas Cole, and he is there with his portfolio under his arm, and he is looking out at this, gorgeous American prospect with the writer and friend William Cullen Bryant. And it is, an iconic painting, and it's perfect for us to sort of put our minds a little bit into the 19th century and be thinking about, I think actually the Hudson River School is still really part of us. This idea, I lived in Vermont for a while, and I would say when I went on a walk on a Sunday that I was going to church. I think we still feel, regardless of our religious persuasion, we often feel closer to whatever is our spiritual roots when we are out amongst nature and amongst creation, however it came about and for whatever purpose. And I think we all feel that in these paintings, and that they still have a lot of power. So I'm just going to go through some very short little readings that will help us end on a little contemplative note here. First of all, I'm going to start with the fact that James Fennimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans was published in 1826. And in that novel, which was hugely influential, Cole actually did some illustrations for it, nature is almost a character. And so a couple little excerpts from that. The rays of the sun, and hopefully my internet won't drop out for the third time. The rays of the sun were beginning to grow less fierce, and the intense heat of the day was lessened as the cooler vapors of the springs and fountains rose above their leafy beds and rested in the atmosphere. Still, that breathing silence which marks the drowsy sultriness of an American landscape in July pervaded the secluded spot, interrupted only by the low voices of the men, the occasional and lazy tap of a woodpecker, the discordant cry of some gaudy jay, which we're hearing a lot these days, or a swelling on the ear from the dull roar of a distant waterfall. So that is almost what you would write if you were looking at a painting like this and imagining yourself inside the woodland. And you can understand the importance of nature, I think, in this period really well. Another, James Fennimore Cooper, the whole landscape, which seen by a favoring light and in a genial temperature had been found so lovely, appeared now like some pictured allegory of life, in which objects were arrayed in their harshest but truest colors and without the relief of any shadowing. So here in literature, Cooper is talking about landscape as allegory, which of course we do see in paintings, particularly of Cole, but also Cropsey did some similar. And then this is a great sonnet that William Cullen Bryant wrote. It is called To Cole, the Painter Departing for Europe, a sonnet. Thine eyes shall see the light of distant skies, yet Cole, thy heart shall bear to Europe's strand a living image of thy native land, such as on thine own glorious canvas lies. Lone lakes, savannas where the bison roves, rocks rich with summer garlands, solemn streams, skies where the desert eagle wheels and screams, spring bloom and autumn blaze of boundless groves, fair scenes shall greet thee where thou goest, fair, but different, everywhere the trace of men, paths, homes, graves, ruins from the lowest glen, to where life shrinks from the fierce alpine air. Gaze on them till the tears shall dim thy sight, but keep that earlier, wilder image bright. And I think right there he sums up when we were talking about what's unique about American landscape, this sense of the wild and the unspoiled, and that you could find places without a trace of man. And then Thomas Cole himself wrote in From American Scenery, for those scenes of solitude from which the hand of nature has never been lifted affect the mind with a more deep-toned emotion than that which the hand of man has touched. Amid them, the consequent associations are of God the Creator. They are his undefiled works, and the mind is cast into the contemplation of eternal things. So that really beautifully connects with the spirituality aspect. And of course, this incredibly famous Ralph Waldo Emerson from 1836 excerpt from Nature. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all the currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. And I just have a couple more little things. Cropsey himself saying, the beauties of nature had a charm, and the voice of God came to me through every motionless leaf, on every blade of grass, the odor of the flower, and in every breath of air I drew. And an 1840 publication, published in London, but written by an American, Nathaniel Parker Lewis, who was the highest paid magazine writer of his day, apparently. In his 2 volumes of American Scenery, he wrote, either nature has wrought with a bolder hand in America, or the effect of long continued cultivation on scenery, as exemplified in Europe, is greater than is usually supposed. Certain it is that the rivers, the forests, the unshorn mountainsides, and the unbridged chasms of that vast country are of a character peculiar to America alone, a lavish and large-featured sublimity, if we may so express it, quite dissimilar to the picturesque of all other countries. So we're finding a sense of sort of superiority in our vastness and wildness as well. And I think my last little thing here is Walt Whitman, a bit later, 1855, from Leaves of Grass. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward, nothing collapses. So I think we have one more image of our sun and our Cropsey. We've kept you over an hour. If anybody has any chat they want to talk about or wants to stick around for a few minutes, we're happy. There is a question here. Is there a relationship between early landscape photography and plein air painters? I know a little bit about this in terms of the Barbizon. Gustave Le Gray was, of course, taking amazing, beautiful landscapes in the forest of Fontainebleau, right? As the painters were painting. They weren't really using them as references, but he was expressing many of the same ideas. I don't know if you know anything about it in American painting, Daniel?
Yes, I think some American Hudson River School painters did rely upon photographs to a certain degree. For example, Albert Bierstadt and Thomas Moran, when they went on the U.S. Geological Surveys, many of their colleagues on those surveys were taking photographs that would be made into glass negatives. And sometimes these were very large scale images. Mm-hmm. So sometimes the Hudson River School artists would have a stock of photos that they would use in addition to their sketches to assist them in creating a giant painting like the one that I showed you before by Moran.
It's true. So a lot of those geological surveys started to be accompanied by a photographer as well as an artist. This sort of sense of documenting. I think at the time, probably the paintings of Moran, you know, they're almost like propaganda, right? They have this drama. We didn't even talk about the theatricality of some of these, you know, of church charging people to come in and see his giant panoramas. So there's a lot of you know, this Cropsey is really intimate. It's really personal. It connects in a different way than these huge, awe-inspiring paintings. We're going to thank everybody for being here. Jillian and Kelly, you can pop your faces back on if you want, if you want to. Okay. I'm glad everybody enjoyed it. I'm sorry for my own technical difficulties. And at the beginning, when the slideshow launched, my notes were on screen. And so my notes completely disappeared for a moment. But such is, I guess, live broadcasting in our own small way. I do appreciate, Heather, thank you so much for joining us. I think it provided a really great fascinating to hear about your work and a really terrific springboard for talking in a larger way about what is really a wonderful collection that I don't know if people know enough about or are aware enough of.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Hopefully we can do this again. And we're always happy to take suggestions for topics. So you can type it in the chat, or you can, we'll keep the chat open for a minute or so before we end the meeting. And you can also email us. We're accessible, we're friendly. We want to serve the people who are interested in hearing what we have to say. So thanks everyone and have a good night.